Good evening, everyone. We have a lot to get to in the next hour on a very busy Friday, including new reporting that Ginny Thomas, the wife of Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas, messaged Arizona Republicans in the days after the election, urging them to throw out the people's votes and send Trump electors instead. We'll get to that in a moment. And the San Francisco Archbishop said today that he would ban Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi from receiving communion over her support for abortion rights. Plus, Trump's candidate in Georgia is crashing and burning with days to go to the primary, to the point that Trump himself is trying to back away as fast as he can from the dumpster fire. But we begin with the age of illiberalism, a vision, a movement proclaimed by Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban. Illiberal regimes attack liberal democracy from within, consolidating control over independent institutions. They have elections of a sort, but they so hamper voters' abilities to make informed choices and so heavily control the outcome that the elections are essentially a show. These are the autocratic dreams of a far-right leader obsessed with solidifying a Christian monoculture, and who, in 2014, declared his intention to build an illiberal new state, citing China, Russia, and Turkey as role models. Flash forward to today, where CPAC, the once conservative gathering that is now simply a cesspool of the far right running amok, is holding its conference in Budapest. Speakers include Tucker Carlson and, texting during an insurrection, Mark Meadows. And of course, the aforementioned Hungarian prime minister, who recently won a fourth successive term. Orban makes it clear that he is an ally to the American right, telling CPAC conservatives that the U.S. must align troops for 2024 votes, to fight together to reconquer institutions in Washington and Brussels from liberals who threaten Western civilization. A CPAC in Hungary, its embrace of Orban. This is a frightening development in U.S. politics. American conservatives are paying homage to a far-right strongman aiming to make a party-free country less free. And who, as Zach Beauchamp writes for Vox, Orban has turned replacement theory into state ideology. The racist theory is used to crack down on anything Orban and his allies want: immigration, LGBTQ freedoms, any threat to white Christian nationalism. Orban isn't even shy about stamping out the free press, saying the path to power is to have your own media, and telling Republicans that shows like Tucker Carlson's show should be broadcast 24/7. Tucker is partly responsible for turning replacement theory into a standard talking point for the Republican Party, something we saw today when Texas Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick spread this lie on Fox News.
Their plan is to bring in millions of people into this country illegally, that they can give them a green card, citizenship, and turn them into voters so they can control the country.
Just another day for the Republican Party promoting the replacement theory, just days after the same conspiracy theory was used to incite racist violence in Buffalo and before the victims are even laid to rest. Joining me now, Jelani Cobb, staff writer for The New Yorker and professor and incoming dean of Columbia University Journalism School, and Tom Nichols, contributing writer for The Atlantic. I want to congratulate you, Jelani, for your new gig. I'm very proud of you. All of your friends are like all cheering for you, so congratulations on that. I have to start with that. But I want you to comment first on just what it means for American politics that one of our two political parties has molded itself in the guise of Viktor Orban.
Well, I mean, I think there's a few things here. One is that, what typically happens with authoritarian states is that you see, and not simply authoritarian, you've seen this in totalitarian states, you've seen this in, kind of communist regimes, that the most autocratic behaviors are described, are cloaked in the language of democracy. And so if you talk about, elections, you mean elections in which not the entire population is allowed to participate. If you talk about freedom, it is a freedom that is leveraged against the lack of freedom or the lack of liberty for other groups of people. Is a kind of implicit fine print comment in the way that authoritarian regimes and authoritarian parties talk about these alleged social virtues. And so obviously this is a concerning dynamic. And the last thing that I want to point out about this is that this is not new. And, I'm like a broken record now because every time I'm on air, I'm talking about the historical roots of this. But back after the World War II, in the immediate aftermath of World War II, the book American Dilemma, Gunnar Myrdal classic on race relations, raised the question of whether the South was fascist. That was a serious scholarly concern. And so what we've seen with the Southernization of American politics is the resurrection of that question of fascism and how much fascism is present in American politics and American society.
And of course, we know that historically, the Nazi regime didn't, they didn't inspire the South. The South inspired them, right? They looked at the way that exactly that black people were treated as a second class and not allowed to participate fully, and they said this is a model that we could use. Tom, I want to get into this now because one of the sort of concepts of republicanism, as opposed to conservatism, but I'll just say republicanism, has always been small government, at least as long as I've been sentient and paying attention to politics. But now what you're seeing is republicanism go to not just big government, but big government that's going to, micromanage the minutia of not just your life, but your spiritual life, and try to impose upon the public, whether you yourself consider yourself their kind of Christian or not, impose their values upon you and make everyone live that way, whether it's abortion or anything else. I want to read something from the Washington Post about Doug Mastriano. This is the man who would like very much to be governor of Pennsylvania. He wrote in his thesis when he was at a military college, and he warned of in his master's thesis that the United States was vulnerable to a left-wing Hitlerian putsch that would begin with the dismantling of the U.S. military. And his thesis, it sort of runs all through it. We're going to put it up on screen and let people read it. But it was a worldview that essentially said that there had to be a hyper-Christianity, an end to homosexuality, and an end to the liberalism and political correctness. Otherwise, you were basically going to have a coup. Your thoughts on that type of a person putting himself forward to be the ostensibly conservative, I'll put it in scare quotes, Republican governor of a state?
One thing I think that emanates from all these people is a huge amount of just pure sweaty fear. And this is something that, again, I think those of us who became Republicans back in the late 70s or the early 80s, when the Republican Party not only projected confidence, but I would say even overconfidence that, the Republicans kind of said, we have the answers to everything. Our solutions will work. Now, this is a party and a group of people that believe in nothing, that there is a nihilistic, fear-driven alliance here with a group of opportunists. And I want to get back to this issue about Hungary, because the really dangerous thing here is that some of these people believe very deeply in some of this stuff, and yet others, and I would throw people like Carlson and Matt Schlapp and some of the other people capering about in Budapest, don't believe in any of this and don't believe in anything other than the extension of their own personal power and wealth. And when you have this coalition of shallow, empty opportunists, along with a group of paranoids, basically, then you have a really dangerous movement, because each side has to keep upping the ante to kind of justify why they're doing the things they're doing.
Yeah,
this is a movement that doesn't stand for anything, and most of them are just full, to use the president's term, full of malarkey. You don't see Orban turning away European Union money or pulling out of NATO or doing any of the things that, a hard right authoritarian would do. A lot of this is an act, but the problem is that you then paint yourself into a corner with that act, and you have to start actually trying to put forward policies and carry things out that make you look as if you believe the things you're doing. And then after a while, whether it's an act or whether it's it's opportunism, is no longer relevant. You have become the thing you've been prancing about and pretending to be. And I think that is just immensely dangerous, because it is both it's a combination both of deeply held, very paranoid, fearful beliefs, coupled to intensely nihilistic opportunism. And those are two of the most dangerous groups in any liberal society, especially when they decide to join forces and use each other for the pure ends of power.
Yeah, and I think that I would put into the category of people you said who are just using this, for their own political powers, people like Mitch McConnell, people like Kevin McCarthy. But then there are people like the Supreme Court justices who are now in the majority, because I think they are true believers. I think they do believe in a Christian nationalist in their minds, they've been sort of put on earth by God to form this country into a certain kind of Christian country, whether the majority wants to or not. And so I think about Clarence Thomas, who made this comment that, you know, people just don't want to deal with outcomes they don't like. Really, Clarence? You might want to have a talk with your wife. Because Ginni Thomas is not only an insurrectionist, but now the Washington Post reports that she actually engaged Arizona lawmakers herself to try to urge them to set aside the mere democracy of a vote and put in Trump electors anyway. She couldn't accept the outcome that she didn't like, and she is a true believer. So I'm going to give each of you an opportunity to comment on that, because not only do you have, Jelani, the commentariat, the people like Tucker who make money doing this, but you have people that are sleeping in the same bed with a member of the Supreme Court who could decide actual cases about who decides who is the president of the United States, actively engaging in insurrection.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I think, you know, first, I'm going to take a dean's prerogative and say I don't want to comment directly on the Thomas reality of it. But I will say that one thing that's become clear from this situation and prior situations is that the standards for recusal, you know, on the Supreme Court, which have been notoriously lax, are something that in a functioning society, which we I think scarcely qualify it as at this point, that would have been something that would have been reformed a long time ago, because it's simply inconsistent with any kind of view of democracy that those two things could coexist.